As Americans, there's few things we love more than democracy. Heck, we love spreading democracy. I mean, if you could hold a black light over the globe, you'd see more U.S. democracy spread across the world than fluid on a bedspread in a cheap motel. But sometimes, I question what exactly we mean by democracy. I mean, there's stuff like the fact that billionaires control our elections now. We have a conservative activist Supreme Court overruling Congress. And the President of the United States has recently been granted the ability to break the law while in office for pretty much any reason. Now, these are all relatively new. But if we open up the oven door and peek inside, there are 3 procedural quirks that are baked into our system that we kind of take for granted. But they should make us question how democratic our little democracy really is. UNFTR. So let's talk about the concept of a representative democracy. See, the grand idea behind our republic is that the people would have a say in elections. And by people, I mean white men who own land, of course. We would have a balance of power that prevented any one branch of government from having too much power. Like 9 despots in black robes granting immunity to a president if he murders somebody in the White House. And that our representation would be periodic and not subject to the tyranny of monarchical rule. So I want to start with our original sin, that of the Electoral College, because there's actually been 5 presidents in our little history who lost the popular vote. John Quincy Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, and more recently, George W. Bush and Donald Trump. Now, obviously, we tend to focus more on the recent examples, but the early ones were way more egregious than anything that we've lived through. I mean, Andrew Jackson basically had the election stolen from him by a bunch of people in a smoke-filled room, though he would exact his revenge at the polls and win by a huge margin the next time around. But the early examples were a reflection of our immaturity as a nation. The fact that a group of men in a room could just be like, nope, and give the presidency to someone else was pretty much cured over time. Now, more recently, the losses of Al Gore to Bush and Hillary Clinton to Trump stung more because we theoretically had a far more representative system with voting rights extended to all and not just white dudes with land. So in these cases, we truly had a popular vote going one way and our archaic system of the Electoral College pulling it the other. So depending upon who winds up on the losing end of the Electoral College, in both modern cases, of course, it's the Democrats, the arguments for abolishing it are pretty loud and consistent. So the first part of the argument goes like this. It's not fair, because the majority is never supposed to answer to the minority. It's exactly the opposite of what we think democracy should look like. And the second part is that people say this isn't what the founders intended. So let's get away from the fairness argument for a second and just take a closer look at the second one, because it is a bit more complicated than that. To understand how it all came about, let's talk to the founders themselves.
I see dead people.
Now, we don't have to have a seance or anything. All we have to do is just read a few passages from the Federalist Papers. They're the crib notes to the Republic and the closest thing that we have to truly ascertaining the intent of the founders. And the reason I like to quote from them is because the 4,500 words that comprise the final product, otherwise known as the Constitution, are often twisted to fit a particular dogma. So why not just go to the source? So we're going to pull a couple of quick passages from Madison's paper number 39, because Madison did most of the heavy lifting on the separation of powers and the nature of elections. So the first one is, quote, "The president is indirectly derived from the choice of the people, according to the example in most of the states." So point of order, the name Electoral College didn't come about for many years after the founding. But the idea that presidential power is, quote, indirectly derived from the choice of the people is the important part of this. Now, later in the 39th paper, Madison writes, quote, "The executive power will be derived from a very compound source. The immediate election of the president is to be made by the states in their political characters. The votes allotted to them are in a compound ratio, which considers them partly as distinct and co-equal societies, partly as unequal members of the same society." End quote. So we know that the founders did indeed conceive of an indirect election from a, quote, very compound source. So let's talk about what they were actually trying to achieve, because they were walking a fine line with the southern states in particular. See, it was understood that the northern states would ultimately win the population battle for 2 reasons. The first is that manufacturing was taking hold in the north and cities were becoming large population centers. So this would ultimately tip the balance of power toward the north, purely from a population count perspective. The second is that a significant portion of the population in the South was enslaved and ineligible to vote. So the idea of an indirect and compound source was intentional. The argument that would be known as the Electoral College is somehow then against the wishes of the founders doesn't really hold if you want to be an originalist and use their exact words. But I want to introduce another compromise that factors into the idea of fairness and representation of the states: the Senate. The Senate was always intended to be the ultimate, quote, cooling power in our legislative branch. Equal representation of the states in the Senate was designed to prevent or just slow down mob rule legislation in the House, which is really the most democratic of the branches in that citizens do have a direct ability to elect their representatives. Now, interestingly, while negotiations were underway to determine how the chief executive would be elected, Madison was pushing for the ability of the federal government to veto any state legislation, which would have placed way too much power into the hands of the Federalist. So, to be clear, all of these negotiations that were going on were designed to determine the balance of power, but the negotiations, for the most part, hinged on the idea of slavery. Of course, there were other factors, but this was the part that Southern states really tried to protect the most. So there's an argument to be made that it's time to retire the Electoral College because the primary rationale that the Southern states argued for the indirect and compound source was to preserve an institution that no longer exists. Moreover, states' rights are preserved and protected due to the existence of the Senate, or co-equal societies, as Madison put it. So, if you're an originalist, there are arguments to be made on both sides. As a textualist, you stand behind the indirect and compound arguments. As an originalist, on the side of intent, you know that this was done primarily to protect something that no longer exists, and therefore renders it moot. Now, all that being said, I've gone back and forth in this in my mind over the years and land in a kind of a different place, but I'll save that for later. It's interesting to note, by the way, that in the history of our country, there have been at least 700 proposed amendments to either modify or just abolish the Electoral College, more than any other subject of constitutional reform. So we're going to return to the Electoral College at the end of the episode to talk through the validity of abolishing or reforming the system. But now, let's look at more procedural fuckery, specifically creepy old Uncle Jerry. In 1812, Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry created a redistricting plan in his state that included a district that looked like a salamander. Gerry made a salamander district, and that's how the term gerrymander was born. Much like the term swing state, which originated after a drunken and debaucherous night of spouse swapping in Ohio in 1846. Of course, that's not true, but the gerrymander story is. Anyway, the official definition of gerrymandering is the intentional manipulation of district boundaries to discriminate against a group of voters on the basis of their political views or race. So every 10 years, state legislatures, or independent panels, depending upon how the state determined the process will go, take the data from the most recent census and draw new district maps. The more screwed up the shape of the district, the more it's been quote-unquote gerrymandered. Now, the process has been abused by both sides, so don't let anyone tell you that it hasn't. Of course, the most blatant and extreme examples of it have typically been done by Republicans, and Republicans have gerrymandered twice as many districts as Democrats. I'm sorry, it's just true. And guess what? What? When Republicans redraw districts, it's usually pretty racist. Get out of town. Yeah, no, it's true. There have been several examples over the years where districts were drawn to deliberately squeeze in or squeeze out voters based upon race. In fact, in 2010, courts found that maps in 4 different states were improperly drawn by race and party affiliation and wound up redrawing them to be more accurate and representative. Today, it's getting even crazier because big data is entering the picture, so these maps are getting ever more specific instead of broad and representative. And adding even more pressure to the problem is that the Supreme Court in 2019 ruled that gerrymandering cannot actually be challenged in federal court. Just another example of how presidential elections have consequences, and the composition of the Supreme Court matters, as if you didn't know. Anyway, if Democrats are unable to properly reapportion districts to be more representative, then they'll continue to struggle for the next decade in state legislatures and in the House of Representatives. Now, there are a couple ways to effectively fix this stupid and partisan, too often racist process. that was never intended to be this broken. One is a concept called ranked choice voting. It's possible that many of you have heard of it because it's been gaining traction over the past several years in municipal and lower stakes elections. And how is it supposed to work, you might ask? Basically, it's math. Whether it's a 1v1 or multiple candidate election, ranked choice voting ensures that every vote counts. Essentially, voters fill out their first, second, third, however many options there are choices, and once the top candidates cross a particular threshold, the bottom votes are thrown out and their second choices are awarded to the top spot and so on. Oh, yeah. No, I don't get it. I really don't either, and there's some math behind this that's above my pay grade and some literature out there suggesting that it's not as equitable as supporters hope, but the consensus view seems to be that it's at least more fair than what we currently have. Now, a couple of bills that would implement ranked choice, like the Fair Representation Act, haven't gone and won't go anywhere, anytime soon at least, because you're basically talking about reshaping our entire democratic process. However, as ranked choice rolls out in districts and municipalities across the country, the more we'll get used to it over time. There's a more immediate and realistic way to attack this issue, though, which we'll cover shortly. But it's fascinating to think what we might look like replacing the winner-take-all gerrymandered process that we currently live in. It's actually amazing just how undemocratic it really is. Enlightenment philosophers from John Locke to James Madison believed in majority rule. Sort of, although as we pointed out in the Electoral College section, to the extent that majority rule was among a particular class of people. Yeah, people who look like me. But the idea that the majority of even this class of people, the elected officials of our main governing body, could be overpowered by the minority was anathema to our founding principles. From a practical and philosophical standpoint, maybe no other procedural quirk would stink as badly to the founders as the filibuster.
And I'm going to stay right here and fight for this lost cause, even if this room gets filled with lies like these.
Southern racists created the filibuster to prevent the North from changing laws regarding slavery, and they even invoked Madison's own words to defend the use of it. The only problem was that when they were doing it, Madison was still alive and was like, "That's not at all what I said." So Madison eventually came around to appreciate the idea of the Senate, for example, as a cooling power against legislative mob rule, but he never supported the idea that the will of the majority in the legislature could be scuttled by procedural means, especially something as ridiculous as the endless debate known as the filibuster. So the filibuster was perfected by John Calhoun, perhaps one of the most influential and racist members of Congress who ever lived. It actually has a neat, if not maddening, backstory involving Aaron Burr, sir. The original loophole came about with the elimination of something called the previous question rule. It's something that allowed the Senate supervisors to essentially tell the minority or the opposition to wrap it up when they were arguing something. It was one of a host of small rules that the Senate was just looking to clean up and streamline. So the idea to get rid of the previous question rule came from none other than Aaron Burr. When it was struck from the rule book, Calhoun had an epiphany: to just talk until the opposition couldn't stand it anymore and gave up. From that point forward, almost every instance was used to defend the institution of slavery. After slavery, it was used to protect Jim Crow laws. After Jim Crow, it was used to argue against civil rights legislation, and on and on and on. Take Richard Russell, a senator from 1933 to 1971, who said, quote, "Any Southern white man worth a pinch of salt would give his all to maintain white supremacy." Russell used the filibuster against civil rights more than anyone else before him. Whether it's in the right hands or the wrong hands, the filibuster is a weapon of mass obstruction. So today, senators don't even have to take to the floor. They don't have to call emergency sessions to make a quorum secretly or any other procedural attempts to forestall legislation and enact the filibuster. Today, they just have to send an email. In the modern era, Mitch McConnell embodies obstruction through the use of filibuster maybe more than anyone. In his book Kill Switch, Adam Jentleson maps out McConnell's journey from arguing in favor of campaign finance reform and getting money out of politics in the 1970s to selling his soul to Roger Ailes and eventually leveraging the filibuster to block any attempts at campaign finance reform. So from blocking nearly every domestic agenda item under Barack Obama to blocking Merrick Garland to replace Antonin Scalia, to passing Trump's massive tax cuts, it's McConnell's country that we're all living in right now. Now, neither party has had the guts to end the filibuster when given the opportunity, because neither one is willing to give up the power to overcome majority rule when it falls out of the majority. So that means that any meaningful legislation, such as legislating reproductive rights or denying them federally for that matter, needs a supermajority to pass. So we've got three pretty significant features of our democracy that are outrageously undemocratic. The Electoral College has denied the majority in the election of the executive 5 times so far. State legislatures literally redraw absurd districts along racial and political lines to keep numbers in the House. And senators have the ability to block almost every piece of legislation that either isn't a supermajority or wrapped up in a spending bill, which seems to be the only way that we can legislate anymore. But there is an answer to at least a lot of this, something called the For the People Act, and it accomplishes a great deal. It's been introduced in the last couple of Congresses, but it hasn't gone anywhere, which is a shame. So it not only establishes independent commissions to redraw districts, it overhauls campaign financing, expands voter access and registration, and establishes clear ethics and standards for sitting elected officials. The filibuster, it's a procedural thing. It doesn't need to be legislated. It's literally just the Senate changing its own rules of engagement. But it's key to passing things like the For the People Act and other important legislation. So that kind of has to happen first, and it'll only happen when we apply enough pressure to whatever party is in power. And then there's the Electoral College. Now, I've gone back and forth on this over the years, and part of me does think it's patently unfair. Majority rules, right? Or it's at least supposed to. But I also acknowledge that it's easy for me to say since I live in New York, and those of us in blue coastal states like New York and California have a tendency to forget that there's this really large piece of land in between us, or so I'm told. Then, of course, there's the very real original intent argument that it was only designed to preserve an institution that no longer, thankfully, exists. But here's the upside of the Electoral College. It really does force politicians to focus on the whole of the nation and not just where most of the votes are. Also, the swing states that we know of today weren't always the swing states. And with the new census numbers coming out and people on the move since COVID, there's a chance that this too will change over time. So what I like about it is that, true to its intent, the Electoral College ensures representation no matter how small a state or an area. And that's a very democratic thing to do. What I hate about it is the same thing. There's some backwards turds in some places that's not New York that have the ability to sway an election. Sorry, I'm more New York than American sometimes. But here's where I land and why I wanted to go through the background in great detail. The Senate, as James Madison posited, derives its power from the states as political and co-equal societies. And given that so much power is in the hands of this body, the states will forever have a say. And yet, the idea that a minority of this body or any body has the ability to outmaneuver the majority is clearly undemocratic and was never intended to be how the system works. If you look closely at who in the Republic is defending the rights of the majority, ensuring full participation in the democratic process, ending the racist procedural tactic of the filibuster, and calling for the end of gerrymandering, it's only coming from one end of the political spectrum, the progressive left. See, Republicans are holding on to the filibuster. They're holding on to gerrymandering and the resulting corruption of the Electoral College because their numbers are dwindling. Establishment Democrats are balking as well because they're able to conveniently lay the inconvenience of an intractable Congress at the feet of the Republicans, which gives them an easy foil. They've all given in to the concept of lesser evil in all political matters, driving a clear path down the middle in order to preserve their jobs and the ability to attract corporate dollars. There's no other explanation for the behavior of centrist Dems, for example, in the face of clear miscarriages of justice and attempts by Republicans to sideline so many people in the democratic process. They're no longer looking to win. They're just all looking to hold the line indefinitely. If we want a democracy that works for the majority of people on the most pressing issues of our time, the answers are right there. End the filibuster and pass the For the People Act. Forget the petitions and the hashtag activism. Pick up the phone and bug your local Senate office and your congressional office to do these two things. All of our other motivations, climate change, campaign finance reform, reducing the military budget, ending mass incarceration, ensuring that your vote counts, Medicare for all, child welfare protections, food security. These things now become possible if we do the boring stuff first and fix the procedural quirks in our system. It isn't sexy, but it works. These actions alone would bring the political class closer to the voting public and further away from the corrupting influence of billionaires and super PACs. It's the first step on the path to overturning Citizens United. Now, don't get me wrong, it's a long process, but it has to start somewhere. As for the Electoral College, I say leave it, because it forces the political class to pay attention to that huge area between New York and Los Angeles. And more importantly, with fairly drawn districts and money out of politics, it forces our leaders to enact policies that make lives better for the poor, for the working class, for immigrants, the middle class, the underrepresented in this country. And when that happens, election victories kind of take care of themselves. Work for the people, and the electors will elect you. Here endeth the lesson. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, make sure you liked it and subscribe to the channel if you get a chance. It really helps us out in the algorithm. And if you're interested in learning more about the subject matter today, definitely go and order Adam Jentleson's Kill Switch. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Phenomenal resource. I got a lot out of that book, and he's a great writer, by the way. So, if you're interested in keeping up with UNFTR, just go to UNFTR.com. There you can do a whole bunch of things. You can sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It comes out every single Saturday, along with a new episode drop on our podcast. You can find the history of our videos, our podcasts, the essays, archival work that we've done over the past few years. And there's also a directory of progressive resources that I would love for you to check out and submit one of your own if there's something that we've missed. That's it for now. Again, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll catch you in the next one.